So good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Nikki Freeman, and I am the Director of Education at the Holocaust Memorial Miami Beach. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's program, Building Resistance at Treblinka, which is part of our ongoing Holocaust Education Week. While many have heard of the Treblinka revolt, much less is known about how Jews trapped in the camp pulled off this stunning feat. The roots of resistance were evident long before that date as the insurgents worked painstakingly to build trust between prisoners and slowly gain access to restricted areas and desperately needed weapons. Perhaps even more astounding than the actual revolt on August 2nd, 1943, was the evolution of resistance at Treblinka, revealing an impressive plot to undermine the control of guards and set the stage for that final day. So it's now my privilege to introduce Dr. Chad Gibbs. We actually first met each other when we were completing our PhDs and studying Yiddish together in Lithuania in 2017. So we go back a little bit. And today, Dr. Gibbs is an assistant professor and director of the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies at the College of Charleston. His current research project analyzes gender, social networks, and geographies of Jewish resistance at Treblinka. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It's really fun to get to do something together. Almost 7 years after we met at that event in Vilnius. So I'm going to share some slides here and start in on my presentation. I think the best way to begin is usually to begin with an image. And Zoom is not cooperating with me, so let me just get this back to this is at first. There we are. Sorry about that. This many years after the pandemic, you'd think he'd know. All right, there we go. So I want to start with this image. It's the only known photograph of the day of the Treblinka revolt, and you can tell it's from far away. It was taken by a member of the Polish resistance. A man named Franciszek Zabecki took this photo from the nearby Treblinka village and railway station. So he was quite a ways away, but we can tell one thing from this, and maybe I'll be able to get back there, or if I don't cover it, it'll be a great moment for Q&A. We can tell from this picture, even though it's grainy, not that great in black and white, that the smoke rising on that day is an acrid black smoke. It's definitely got an accelerant involved, and I can get back to how that happened eventually. So let me move on to at least covering a little bit about what is Treblinka. So I want to place this in context for any folks that might be joining us tonight who aren't really familiar with where Treblinka fits into the Holocaust overall. So Treblinka is one of the 3 Aktion Reinhard or Operation Reinhard camps. These 3 facilities were only for the purposes of mass murder. They were constructed, designed, envisioned just as places where Nazi Germany would murder Jews. They were part of the plan that became known as Aktion Reinhard that would take over after they had decided to do something other than what Father Patrick Dubois calls the Holocaust by bullets. So having discovered that even as strong ideological adherents, individuals would have a really hard time actually killing people that often by intimate close-range rifle shot, the Nazis decide not to stop their genocide, but to find a better way in their own thoughts. And that way was to construct these 3 camps that would murder by carbon monoxide gas chambers. They're not Zyklon B like at Auschwitz. That's kind of one of the things that separates them. They are 3 of the 6 overall extermination camps that existed during the Holocaust. So here's Treblinka right there, Sobibor in the middle, and Belzec toward the bottom. And the others are Majdanek, Chełmno, and Auschwitz. You've probably heard of all of these. The Aktion Reinhard camps differ in that they have no labor function. There's no attempting to exploit Jewish labor before mass murder. These places exist just for that one purpose. And I have their horrific death tolls and their years of operation on this image here as well. So the creation of these camps we can relate pretty much entirely to where were the largest Jewish population centers and where were the convenient railway lines and where did they think they could put something in relative secrecy. That word secrecy can be a little bit overinflated at times. They definitely didn't keep these camps totally secret, but they at least were not close to major German populations. All of them are in occupied Poland or the general government of occupied Poland. So they're not right next to Germans whose public opinion they actually cared about. Treblinka becomes the most lethal of these three camps for two reasons. One, it's the last to operate, so it actually kind of is able to take in the technical lessons learned of the first two camps. So it is the most refined of all three of the Aktion Reinhard camps. And secondly, probably even more important than that, is that Treblinka is near Warsaw and Białystok. It's on the train line between Warsaw and Białystok, putting it closest to the largest remaining Jewish populations. And Warsaw at that time was like the largest single Jewish city in the world. And of course, the Warsaw Ghetto is there. The Warsaw Ghetto will meet its end in Treblinka itself. So that really accounts for this large death toll. So my work has always been to attempt to put together how did this resistance work? Pull back the veil, go back before August 2nd, 1943, when that pyre of smoke is coming out of the camp, and sort of try to put together how did they do it? Not just this one day story of resistance, but a longer story. And part of that has always been to find new sources. So I'm able to localize this for a South Florida crowd a little bit. The hardest thing to do about researching Treblinka is to find people who survived it. For the longest time, it was thought only 67 individuals survived Treblinka. I have that number up to 258 now, which means you have a lot more testimonies to deal with, a lot more things that they left behind. And in fact, if you just spend a little time dipping into the newspapers.com archive of the South Florida Sun Sentinel, you can find at least 3 Treblinka survivors mentioned in those pages. Morris Pilberg here in the middle, a man named David Lieberman, who worked for a university library for a very long time, and a Leo Weissman. All 3 I just discovered as I had kind of led one winding path after another brought me to the South Florida Sentinel's news archive, and out popped 3 more names. There's every possibility that you down there in Florida may have met more people who survived Treblinka and settled there, or that they left behind sources in some archive anywhere around your area. There are always more coming. The idea that there were only 67 is kind of an accident left behind by a very well-meaning book that historians just took too seriously for too long. This book here is shown on this slide. It's The Death Camp Treblinka by a man named Alexander Donat, who was himself a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto. He wasn't in Treblinka, but he became obsessed with its history and wrote about it. And he was also quite deeply involved in wanting to tell people that Jews resisted, that there was this large resistance history. His first thing that he ever published was a small volume just called Jewish Resistance. He really wanted people to know that story, just about the Warsaw Ghetto, about the camp, about wider histories as well. So he put together this book, and at no point in the book does he ever say, here's 67 names and they're the only names. He even says at the top of his list, these are just the people I could find. And you can tell if you look into him a little bit, he's not a professional researcher. He hasn't got a lot of university money behind him or anything. He is on a shoestring budget. He's a man with a passion. He wants to tell a story. He managed just to find 67 people, and he thought he was leaving it for others to add to this list. But historians have made the mistake for some 44 years now of basically going, oh, here's the list. That's all the people who survived Treblinka. And that left us with the idea that there wasn't enough sources to do more work to find out what happened here. So after saying that I've found more, what I do once I know about those new sources, what I ask of them, what I kind of read through them looking for, is gender, geography, and social networks. So gender is like in literally where were women, because we kind of have written them out of this story as well. They were a small population at Treblinka, but we will talk about the massively important ways that they participated in resistance and how that was enabled by their gender. It's not just a matter of women were there, but they were also resisting and resisting as women. And also part of this story is always, how did they get access to territory within a lethally controlled extermination camp? It makes no sense unless you pull it apart piece by piece. Because at any given time, if you were a prisoner in this place, you had the right to be where you worked and where you slept and the path in between. And if you were somewhere else, that could be immediately lethal. So putting together full access to the camp to be able to put together a resistance would require social networks. It would require relationships between people who could trust each other. And one of the great benefits of trying to put together resistance at Treblinka was that the Nazi guards at this place were not all that good at what they were doing. They were actually all drawn from the T4 euthanasia program. They had been hospital orderlies, you could say. They had been involved in the mass murder of Germany's mentally disabled or physically disabled populations. So Nazi Germany looked at them as people who knew how to kill, which they did, but they did not also know how to run a camp. So that was a missing part of the story, quite luckily. And Jewish prisoners at Treblinka took full advantage of that. So I want to make a comparison to a place you might all know exactly what's going on in this photo the moment it pops up. This is, of course, the entry ramp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. There are two columns of people there. You can see in the background that arch that is quite famous for kind of being our image of Birkenau, this entryway here. You can see that the train is pulled in along this siding. You can see the roof of it on the left. Women and children have been separated to one side, men have been separated to the other. Selection hasn't actually occurred yet. This is the moment right before selection. Men and women have been separated, children with women, men on that side. And next, the SS doctor standing on the ramp will do some form of quick cursory look over of people and say, you're capable of work, you're not. And however many people are ruled capable of work will be brought into the camp, where even once they're in it, their life expectancy will be around 3 months, but they will have survived arrival. As terrible as that is, arrival out at Treblinka is very different in the sense that there are not mass selections of people needed for work or capable of work. If 1 or 2 people on the work details inside Treblinka had been killed or died or taken their own lives out of sorrow, they would be replaced, and those 2 might be the only picked to survive from a train of up to 6,000 or more per day. So we're not talking about mass selection. We're talking about just 1s and 2s and little bits here and there. And the process of who gets chosen, I want to try to not use the word selection because I'm trying to separate these 2 things. The process of who gets chosen ends up being one led by the Jews alive inside Treblinka, the slave laborers who are forced to help run this place. So this is a CGI sort of like artist's representation of what the arrival area at Treblinka looked like, because there's nothing left there other than a memorial today. So we have to kind of try to piece it back together from maps, from prisoner recollections, etc. But people would get off the train that you can see in the foreground there. There's that entry ramp right in the immediate foreground here. Then there's this gate where people would be rushed through that gate, and women would be made to go into this barracks building on the left, in which there are no beds. It's just, it exists for the purpose of making women undress inside that building. And the last 20 feet of that building is where they put together what they called the barber shop, where, of course, women's heads were shaved before they went into the gas chamber. Men were made to undress outdoors, right in this outdoor area that you can see in the middle here. While they did so, there were Jewish prisoners who were members of one or two different groups. They were either the red commando or the blue commando by armbands that they wore, who would be giving orders like tie your shoes together, put your clothing over here, so on and so forth, like they had those jobs. They also, because there wasn't strict, stringent, close-eyed supervision by well-trained or well-suited guards, they had the ability to sort of make suggestions to the prison guards or the Nazi guards that ran this camp of who should be brought in. Oh, look, you so and so died yesterday or was sent to his death. We need a new bricklayer. You should pick this person. So if you'll forgive my absolutely terrible ability to draw a network on a slide here, what is enabled by the fact that the guards aren't really taking part in who gets chosen is that Jews actually choose who comes in. They can't, of course, save everyone, but it becomes a matter of who do they trust, who do they recognize immediately from pre-war life, and then say to themselves, oh, I can trust that person. He or she, sometimes, mostly he, would be a usable member of the conspiracy. I can bring them in immediately. There really can't be enough stress put on the idea that trying to form a relationship of trust inside of a place like Treblinka when you come from not knowing someone at all, I would imagine is nearly impossible. But taking a pre-war relationship and leaning on that seems to be what people always went back to. They slept in the barracks at night according to where they came from. So all the people from Częstochowa in Poland slept in one area of the building, all the people from Warsaw in another area of the building. They stayed around who they already knew. These pre-existing relationships were a really big deal. So inside of that is these pre-existing relationships in a sense of one-on-one. And the relationships that come out are really indicative of how much the Nazi guards are not really paying attention. So my favorite example, my absolutely favorite example, is Morton Mattel, who we don't even have a photograph of. I would love to find one someday, but I haven't so far. Morton Mattel was brought into Treblinka because Lagerältester Galewski, which is a German title given to this Jewish prisoner. He's the camp elder or highest ranking Jewish prisoner inside Treblinka. And because he's got that role, he's kind of, I don't know if it's trusted is the right word by the Germans, but, you know, they don't suspect him and they think that he's going to do the work he's been assigned. But he is totally in on the resistance. He's actually one of its main planners. And he's always at the entry ramp there looking for people who might be able to help with an uprising. He's definitely got that idea in his mind the whole time. He tells the Nazis one morning that Morton Mattel is a translator and they should bring him into the camp as a translator because they've been saying they need someone who can talk to the different people who are getting off the train to give them the orders of what they need to do when they get off the train. Well, Morton Mattel is monolingual. He only speaks Polish. He can't even fake being a translator. That's how close we can see the guards are paying attention. He doesn't have any other languages. So he's brought in, Lagerältester Galewski, Alfred Galewski just says, tell them this story so that they bring you in. It works. He's brought in on the resistance conspiracy, given a role in trying to prepare for a revolt. Samuel Reisman is much in the same way. He tells them that this person can fulfill a role that they want. They had known each other because their daughters attended a clandestine school, an underground school in the Warsaw Ghetto together, and that's how they knew each other, and how they came to at least be able to trust each other. And we know from what Reisman said also that Galevsky wasn't standing there thinking, maybe I'll bring these people in because I just know them. He actually tells Reisman in no uncertain terms that he's been brought in to participate in a revolt, because Reisman gets to Treblinka with his whole family. He's saved by Galevsky, but they don't allow in women and children. So his whole family is murdered on the day he gets there. And several hours after he's been brought into Treblinka, he comes to realize that that's exactly what's happened. And he's not happy that he's alive. He's actually furious. And he approaches Galevsky and just shakes him and screams at him, "Why did you keep me alive? Why have you made me endure this place? Why didn't you just let me go with my family?" And Galevsky tells him in this just amazing quote that Reisman wrote down, "I did not save you to make you exist here." And the quote I can really remember word for word is that I brought you here to sell your life at a higher price, to make you a part of this resistance so that you could take part in ending what this place is. And a lot of these different relationships that kind of splay out in these different colors are in the same realm. Alfred Bem had met Samuel Willenberg in pre-war life. Willenberg had actually saved Bem, a kind of slight, smaller boy, from a bunch of Polish street anti-Semitic thugs who were trying to beat up Alfred Bem. And Samuel Willenberg lived to the age of 96, and I think he was quite a tough individual. He's an amazing life story. And he fended off the three street thugs that were trying to beat up Alfred Bem, and Alfred Bem repaid the favor by saving him when he came into Treblinka and introducing him to Alfred Galevsky. That's how he comes into that resistance conspiracy. So who knew who? Once you put together a network of people you can trust, you need to be able to get them into places that will let you bring together a resistance. So there's one hard and fast rule that pretty much never changes after some unsettled periods in the very early days of the camp. But from a midpoint on, this line, if everyone can actually see that cursor I'm using, this green line here is a fence that has tree branches woven through it. This here is a sand berm, and they separate what are called over here the death camp, or Camp 2, and the living camp, or Camp 1. And prisoners on those two sides are never supposed to speak to each other. There's some weird belief among it's just no way of explaining it. There's some strange belief among the SS guards that if they keep only the prisoners in Camp 2 knowing how the machinery of death works, that others won't understand what Treblinka is. That's ludicrous, in fact, because everyone understands what's going on over there, even if they don't take part in it themselves. It's readily apparent to anyone inside Treblinka. But they keep these two prisoner populations second. And one of the things that the conspiracy has to figure out immediately is, well, how are we going to communicate with the prisoners on the other side if we're going to make this a resistance that goes across the whole camp? So here, this red fenced U-shaped building, that's the Jewish building, the Jewish barracks in Camp 1. And this over here is the Jewish prisoner barracks in Camp 2. They managed to put together a communication between them. The easiest way that they find out to do it is to have the construction foreman, Jewish construction foreman prisoner named Yankel Virnik, carry messages back and forth as he's doing construction. But they also find these just amazing ruses to help themselves do day-to-day and small bits of communication. There are, at any given time, about 30 SS guards who are Germans, speak German. And then there are about 120 travniki, or volunteer, so-called volunteer guards, who are primarily drawn from Ukraine, and they speak Ukrainian. They're recruited or kind of forced into German service from POW camps. These are people who have been captured on the field of battle against Nazi Germany, and then are given the opportunity to serve Nazi Germany or stay in the prisoner camp that they're in. That doesn't mean they're not quite anti-Semitic in their own right. They usually were. They were not easy to deal with for the Jewish prisoners, but the bonus was that they were Slavic language speakers, and Yiddish made no sense to them. So prisoners could sing a song to each other while cleaning this path in Yiddish and include messages in it, because the Ukrainian guards just don't understand Yiddish. They could also write it. They wrote notes to each other on the side of cigarettes, they said, in Yiddish, of course. Even if you can kind of catch Yiddish from knowing German, you can't read it at all, of course, because Yiddish is written in Hebrew characters, which not really anyone German really knew during the Holocaust. Very, very vanishingly few could read Hebrew text. So they would write messages to each other on the side of a cigarette and throw it over the berm, with the bonus that once smoked, said message is gone. So these are some of the ways they found to communicate with each other. And they used at the same time Lagerältester Galewski, the camp elder Galewski's power to move people around between different work details, to put people they trusted throughout the different work details, because each work detail has the ability to access different parts, geographies of the camp. Like, oh, the group 5 can enter this building, group 4 can enter such and such building, so on, so forth. Like, the work details give you access to space, as historians would put it. And those two in red at the bottom are the work details that work inside the death camp. Dentists, just very briefly, without trying to focus on the horrid nature of it, they're the people who remove gold teeth. And group 7, of course, is those that carry the bodies. So that's the largest work detail. There's at least 200 people who have that terrible job. But to get access to the whole camp, you're going to need people on all of these different work details, which thankfully the camp elder and the capos, this is not a place where you should think of capos as being against the prisoners. The capos are also Jewish, and most of them are in on the resistance. So once put together and sort of reshuffled by those who are in on the conspiracy, they are able to bring in all of the different groups to the conspiracy, including, if I draw your attention to group 4, what's called the Hofjuden. That's a medieval term that it means court Jews, which was brought back in sort of like a sarcastic, mean joke sense by the Nazis to mean like privileged prisoner. So these are the individuals who have some sort of skill that the Nazis desire to keep alive inside of Treblinka. So their lives are slightly more secure. I never want to over stress that, but they have something they can rely on to try to keep themselves alive. They're shoemakers, tailors, carpenters, masons, locksmiths. They're very important to keeping the camp running, and to the other side business. The Nazis are always trying to personally profit off of Treblinka. So a tailor is used perhaps not just to repair the clothing of the murdered that will then go on to Germany, but also to make luxury goods for the guards that they then take back to their families when they go on leave. They use several ruses like that to further their resistance. But those Hofjuden, those court Jews or prominent prisoners, can access a lot more of the space of the camp. They work and live in this workshop side of the barracks, but they can leave it to do their technical tasks like roof maintenance and everything else around the whole SS living area of the camp. If I go right back past that slide of the work details again, I want to stress that those work details list came from Samuel Reisman's Nuremberg trials testimony. But what he didn't cover at that time, and is a pretty long discussion of what men would say and would not say after the war, is he didn't really cover the issue of women prisoners. He never really brings that up. And he certainly didn't tell you in that list, which I haven't abridged, he never tells you where women are working. But we do know from other testimonies, even that of guards when they're on trial later, that women worked and lived in both Camp 1 in this building here, where they lived at the letter G in the very corner of the building there and worked in the various shops within it and elsewhere, and over here in Camp 2. Women in Camp 2 bring us to one of the harshest realities of dealing with the history of resistance at Treblinka. Camp 2 had at least 13 women prisoners. Many of them worked in a camp laundry and a kitchen, but there were also 8, it appears, that worked in a camp brothel. So they were forced into a position of sexual servitude inside of Treblinka. And as horrific as that most certainly was, they used on the day of the revolt that position to help arm the resistance. The brothel inside of Camp 2 appears to have been used by those SS Ukrainian guards, those non-German guards that I talked about that were recruited from prisoner of war camps, and by certain capos, certain even Jewish male capos had the privilege, as it was thought, to go to that so-called brothel. But on the day of the revolt, it seems that there were 8 of those Treblinka guards, the Ukrainian guards, in the brothel at that time, and a male prisoner was sent running into that place to gather up the rifles of the men who were distracted in the process of being at the brothel, and 8 rifles for the purpose of fighting back in Camp 2 area come directly from the women who were forced to work in that place. And without giving all the direct quotes, just to keep myself moving here and keep this more dynamic, there are pieces of the testimony here that really show in their very wording, like where one calls them our girls. I think he's using the possessive because he's saying they were part of the resistance. One says, our girls distracted the guards. So I think that that's a deliberate ploy. It's not just that they're employed at this terrible brothel and forced to endure this. They're also using that position as a way to arm the resistance. And the wording of those testimonies, just to sum that up again, I think makes it sound like that's quite deliberate. That's a thing they're doing on purpose. So if that's how Camp 2 becomes armed on the day of the revolt, how Camp 1, the larger area of Treblinka, becomes armed is a different story, and it involves a key, getting a key to the SS Armory. So I want to tell you about my 2 pictures first, because they're pretty darn amazing. The black and white photograph here is one of the few photographs that exists of the area of Treblinka inside the camp, but it's a post-revolt picture. It's from the period of time where they are forcing the remaining prisoners who didn't escape to break down the camp and clear its area. So you can see this stone structure right here. You can even see a prisoner sitting on top of it. Perhaps he's helping knock it down at the time. But it's not all that existed. There was, splaying out in this direction all the way to about here, a wooden SS barracks building where the guards lived, and another equal building went off in the other direction. It was in between 2 barracks buildings and kind of existed as like this center tower. This thing, though, this rare brick building inside of Treblinka, this first floor is the SS Armory. And making this into an armed revolt is going to require getting a hold of the key to that armory. The other picture that I have here is actually taken not too long ago by a College of Charleston student, because while walking around Treblinka, and I'm not sitting here trying to tell you that this is the key, but absolutely amazingly walking around Treblinka, they kicked loose a key from the ground at Treblinka itself. It blows me away. I can't believe that happened. Many, of course, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people probably brought their house keys to Treblinka, thinking that they would eventually go back home, or hoping that they would. So I'm not trying to say that is the key to the armory, but I can't get over the fact that a student at the college I now work at once kicked a key loose on a study abroad trip to Treblinka. But setting that aside for a second, the manner of how to get a hold of the key itself is maybe one of the most remarkable parts of telling the story of Treblinka, because they get a hold of this key by constantly playing upon what it is that the guards believe or the guards want from their existence at Treblinka. So they tell the guards, you know, this is Galevsky, because he's actually one of the Jewish prisoners who communicates with guards. He tells them, at night the guards do a lot of drinking and they leave bottles around the camp. You should allow me to appoint a prisoner who'll go pick up the bottles, keep your living area clean, and keep it from just looking like there's been some sort of terrible party that went on. However he phrased it to the guards, that is. And they took the idea. He could always appeal to their own vanity, to their own desire to be served, to their own desire to have things made perfect for them. And he marketed the idea of cleaning up the area around the SS barracks. It was bottles strewn all around here, because they would just drink around their barracks, throw things out the window, or drink outdoors and drop things where they finish them, all of that sort of thing. So he's trying to get a prisoner close to the SS barracks. That's his whole ulterior motive. We have, if I can flip backward, Alfred Bem pushing a baby stroller that, if you can see that in this image, is full of beer bottles and other like liquor bottles. This is a sculpture created by Samuel Willenberg, immortalizing Bem being that very prisoner who cleaned up around the SS barracks, pushing that stroller full of bottles. And it's important because Bem and Adek, a young man who worked in the same sort of detail with him, eventually one day walk up to the SS armory while no one is keeping an eye on them directly. They're allowed to be there. They have access to that space through a lie told to the guards by Lageraltista Galevsky. And when they're right in front of that door that you can see right here, they take out a small pin and they jam that pin into the door lock so that a key won't fit in it anymore. It just will look as if the door lock has failed. So once they try the lock and they discover that that problem exists, the guards simply do what they normally do in any work type situation. They order Jewish prisoners to do the work of removing the door from its hinges, taking it to the two Jewish locksmiths who are on the Hofjuden or court Jew staff, the prominent prisoners staff, and making them fix the lock and make a new key. Well, they do that, but then in another moment that is just kind of amazing to read in the testimonies that recall it, these two locksmiths stage an argument between each other as they're creating this key, as they're fixing the broken door, and they fake a fight between each other so that the key will fall on the floor as they fight each other and scream at each other in a language that the Germans can't understand. And as the Germans break up the fight and put them back to doing the work of fixing this door, somebody leans over, one of the prisoners leans over, picks up the key that they've dropped off the floor, and as he's standing up, but with his back to the guard, as he's coming back up, he presses the key into locksmith's putty so that they have a perfect outline of the key. And once the guard has left with his key and the door, they can make a new key from the outline in the putty. So they get their own key to the armory. And it becomes just a matter of, well, how do we get people back in front of that armory to pull out weapons on the day of the revolt? That's actually just another means of telling the Nazis lies that they want to hear, or luring them into ruses that they want to participate in through their own vanity or agenda. So reflected in a map made by an earlier historian. I didn't make this map, and I think it's good to know that, because then I can tell you about what I've learned about a structure that we already understood from someone else's research. These two green lines in front of the barracks buildings, this spot right here labeled 7 is the armory that you could see in the previous photo, still remaining, but once these buildings alongside it had been burned down. These green lines are flower planters, kind of like built up planters in front of the barracks. It was another suggestion by Jewish prisoners. Why don't you let us beautify your living area? If we plant flower planters in front of your barracks, it'll knock down the smell. Because just for a moment to think about how horrific the smell of the bodies burning in Camp 2 just this far away must have been for anyone inside of Treblinka. Jacob Flaws's work has talked about how it could be smelled more than 20 miles away. So inside of the camp, it must have been nearly unbearable for anyone. This idea of putting in these flower planters is approved by the guards, and that gives prisoners the right to be in front of the very armory itself on the day of the revolt. You can see a horse cart right here as they're picking up after the revolt. It may have even been the same horse cart. It was a cart. That's all I can say for sure. A cart was parked in front of this door under the guise of working on those flower planters. The key that they had already gotten a hold of was used to open that door. Weapons and ammunition from inside of that armory were taken out, hidden in that cart, and taken over to the letter A right here, which was the camp kitchen where women worked. They used gender to their advantage again, because far less suspected by German guards are Jewish women. They don't expect Jewish women to be their liability when it comes to the possibility of resistance. They believe the ideology of the weaker sex. And the prisoners take advantage of this. So they put all of those weapons with the women to hold them. Never suspected by the German guards. It's not searched. And prisoners can come to that place and get their weapon that they've been assigned and get to their assigned attack area in advance of the revolt. That is at least the plan. What ends up happening on the very day of the revolt is that the plan sort of comes apart. I've given you sort of a short version of the plan, of course, in only a few minutes here. The problem is that they're amazing people that put together this revolt, and I don't want to critique them at all, except to say that in that day, it became too complex, and their plan had too many moving parts, if you will. And once one thing broke, a lot of things could fall apart. And as it happened on the day of the revolt, they had decided that morning that they would not allow any more Jewish prisoners to be murdered that day. That if they're going to kill anybody, we will trigger the revolt early and try to save everyone's lives today. We're not going to let them kill anyone else. That is a beautiful but deeply emotional decision that does not really make like resistance tactical sense. Because that eventuality did take place. One of the guards caught 2 prisoners holding money. They were holding money because they were part of the conspiracy, and they intended to use the money they were hiding on themselves to support themselves in hiding once they got outside of the camp. They knew they would probably have to pay Polish locals for food or a place to hide, and they knew they would need money for that. So they took money from the belongings of those who had been murdered in the gas chambers. And one of the strongest rules at Treblinka was any prisoner who has money will be put to death, because one of the whole ideas of Treblinka is allowing the SS, Nazi Germany itself, to profit off of the process of mass murder. They don't want that money going to anyone else. So this guard starts walking these 2 prisoners off to an extermination location. And one of the prisoners, who is already armed, takes a shot at him. It's probably that one guard gets wounded. He did not get killed. He was later involved in the trials that took place after Treblinka. But that shot is interpreted by most people who knew that a revolt was coming that day as the starting signal. So at least an hour early. In the hectic nature of the day of the revolt, everyone seems to recall the time differently. So we can't really say when did they plan to have the revolt. 3, 4, 5, 6 o'clock. It's all over the map. But at least an hour early, by most accounts who seem to be authoritative on what went down there. The shot was fired too early. Not everyone was in their attack place yet. Not everybody had a rifle yet, but Camp 2 was able to arm itself because of the last minute run in, the planned run in to grab the rifles from the guards using the brothel. Those women did their part, armed the revolt, and a pair of women did escape from Camp 2. They're the only 2 women survivors of Treblinka. 258 names so far. 7 are women, but only 2 were there on the day of the revolt. The other 5 had passed through the camp or escaped prior to the day of the revolt. So the long story short on how does the day of the revolt itself go, that early start means it breaks down into a sort of controlled riotous chaos almost immediately. It doesn't go down in the like strict battle plan sense that the organizing committee had hoped for. But 300 Jews get out of the camp on that day, and at least 70 survive the rest of the war. I get to 258 because I'm also counting escapees and people who had passed through Treblinka prior to the day of the revolt. So it's still about 70 individuals that I know of so far who survived the revolt itself. 300 had gotten out, but there were still 21 more months of the war and the Holocaust to endure. So many more lost their lives to one German cause or another. Some also lost their lives to Polish locals who killed them once finding them in hiding after they had escaped from Treblinka. But since I'm down here toward the end, and I want to tell you the story of how we got to the black, acrid fuel smoke that you saw in the first picture. It's one of my favorite examples of telling the Nazis what they want to hear to enable resistance. Nazi German propaganda throughout Europe. I've even seen many posters in Polish warning that Jews carry lice and are spreaders of typhus. They would even spread that propagandistic message among their occupied populations that they didn't really care all that much for. But there's posters that are also in German. This is a common trope of Nazi propaganda that Jews carry some form of lice or other infestation and are therefore unclean, and the Germans need to worry about that. Jews inside of Treblinka even used that against the guards. They admitted, if you want to air quotes that, the idea that Jews, yes, have a lot of lice and we're going to need to do something about that. And they asked the prisoner, the staff, why don't you allow us to assign a prisoner to go around spray fumigating the camp every day? It'll keep down the lice, and you won't get lice from the prisoners. And they agree to this. So a prisoner would go around every day with a backpack sprayer, spraying down the walls of all the different barracks buildings in the camp. And on the day of the revolt, they simply switched out his soapy solution with kerosene, and he walked around spraying Treblinka down with kerosene. And they were able to just set light to all of these buildings that had been hosed down with kerosene and burn the camp. And you see that black pile of smoke coming out of the camp, I think is related to that man who had walked around with kerosene fueling the ability to burn down the camp. So I end on this amazing photo that comes from near the end of the war in Łódź. About 20 prisoners got together in the first reunion of Treblinka survivors, of Treblinka revolt survivors. And they thought, these men that were sitting there at this time, they thought they were the only ones. So in their own first estimation of survival at Treblinka, they thought there were about 20. Not everybody's photographed that day, as you can see. But we can push that number up higher. And I'm happy to tell you any more stories you want to hear about the amazing things that they managed to achieve, and this instance of resistance that is anything but common. There were six extermination camps in Nazi Germany. Only one did not have a Jewish revolt. Only Belzec did not have a revolt. All the rest had a revolt of one type or another. Even Chelmno, in its last days, had a revolt. So I think you can probably hear in my voice, one of my things I'm always trying to do is tell more and more of the story of the revolt and of resistance in general, and make people see that it was as prevalent as can be. And I would leave it there. And thank you very much for attending and your attention.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation. Any questions from the audience? We did have one question during the presentation asking about the key that the student found. Was that returned to someone at the Treblinka site, so they didn't keep it?
No, yeah, exactly. And that would have been, it would have been really bad. But they left that key with museum staff. And they actually have found several. Last time I was there, I saw that there's kind of like a case that's got many of that kind of thing. So kind of drives home that there were many keys brought there, but just another was found by a student.
If there are no questions, I actually want to share something on October 24th, 2014. It was Miriam Kasanoff that brought Samuel Willenberg to Miami.
Wow.
He was at the Guzman Center. I actually have a picture of him on the stage. And at that time, they also had his, one of his, I'm trying to show.
Oh, wow.
Picture
Wow.
of the shoes,
Yes.
which at the time we bought. I think there were 100 copies at the time. Mine was number 28. And when we started talking, I ran over to get it because suddenly it became even more priceless than at the time when we got it. So I do have they called at that evening was called The Last Survivor of Treblinka. So I actually got a chance to see him on the stage.
Amazing.
And see his movie.
I have in the opposite office wall that you're not seeing, I have a framed letter from him. He and I were able to correspond a little bit before his passing. I just wish that I'd had more time to talk with him. I wish he was still with us, but an absolutely amazing man. And it's just so amazing that you have artwork by him. I recognize that very line drawing became one of his sculptures.
Yeah, there was actually a movie about him, and the card that you saw them pushing the cards, he did the figurines. I understood that he had in his home all these figurines that were memories from the camp. I now recall a little bit. I kind of forgot a little bit about it, but you kind of brought to memory some of those things from that evening. That was really an amazing evening with Samuel Willenberg. Yeah.
So his sculptures, his whole wider sculpture array of his memories of Treblinka, spent many years in this basement sort of showroom of his Tel Aviv apartment building.
That's right.
And they are now touring. There is now an exhibition that's touring with them. It was delayed by COVID, etc. And I didn't refresh my knowledge of where it's at right now, but I just really want to get to see wherever that is touring. But if you look for Samuel Willenberg sculptures, I'm sure that you'll find it wherever it is in the world right now.
We have a question asking for some recommendations of books on Treblinka.
Sure. So while we're here, we should just start with Revolt in Treblinka by Samuel Willenberg. I just looked over at my bookshelf there. Willenberg's memoir is quite amazing. I think it is parallel with the also stunningly accurate and incredibly written memoir Trap with a Green Fence by Richard Glazar, who is also briefly a photo in the corner of one of my slides. And then for a historian's take on Treblinka, I would read Belzet's Sobibor Treblinka. It's named the 3 extermination camps of Aktion Reinhard, and that's by Yitzhak Arad, A-R-A-D. And that book was re-released in 2018. It was first from 1985. They re-released it in 2018. Dr. Arad recently passed away. He was himself a Holocaust survivor, IDF brigadier general, and a longtime curator of Yad Vashem. Somebody needs to write his biography, but he left behind that book. It is something that I'm going to add to. If we're in shameless plug territory at some point, a year or 2 from now, I hope that my own book will join those things on Treblinka and be able to further carry forward the memory of these folks. I have a colleague named Jacob Flaws who will also have a book on Treblinka in the near future. So we're finally getting some more things going as it regards research on Treblinka. There's been too little for too long, but we're moving the goalposts now.
We had a question about so a model of Treblinka that is in Israel. Are you familiar with this? Can you comment
Yes.
on the how correct it is? And then also for those of us who have been to Treblinka, can you show us on the map that you have like what we're actually seeing when we visit today?
Well, I don't even have to bring that up, unfortunately, because you would see nothing today. It is a memorial only. There are no original structures. After the revolt destroyed much of the camp, the Nazis decided to attempt to eradicate all traces of what remained. And they even put a pliant Ukrainian sort of volunteer. There's a lot of different words that could be put on this description, but they put a pliant family there to claim they had always been farmers at that location. Of course, everyone saw through that immediately, but there's only a memorial, and I don't mean to downplay the memorial. It's incredibly powerful and a place to see in and of itself, but there are no original structures. Very different from visiting like an Auschwitz in that regard. Dr. Freeman, if you could remind me the first part of the question, I forgot as I
Sure.
answered that.
Also, quick follow-up to that question. So like where the memorial is today, is that perhaps where the barracks were, or is you know a sense of where that might be positioned in the map?
Sure. That I'll reshare, and I'll try to point out kind of rudimentary fashion where the memorial sits. So if I can go back in time a little bit here. So the memorial, it seeks to be sort of right here. This area, the whole SS living area. So let me restart actually. The former railroad track line is where most people walk up to the camp today, or you walk along this path, but you end up kind of outside along the edge of where this fence was. You walk up along, the tracks are gone also, but there is a memorial sort of homage to the tracks. There are large stone structures on the ground, sort of mimicking railroad ties. And you walk along those, and then you get to an area where the ramp, the structure that you would enter on, has been kind of recreated. And then there is a path with 10 stones along one side that have the name of countries from which Jewish victims were deported to Treblinka, sent to Treblinka. So you walk past all of those stones, and then there is a large Treblinka memorial right here. The central memorial is kind of maybe about 3-4 stories tall. It has a menorah type significance on the front of it. You can also see carvings that are slightly reminiscent of your Miami memorial, with hands sort of carved into the top of the memorial. And then throughout this area right here, there are 17,000 stones of all varying different sizes, and they're all shard-like. They're not nicely carved or anything. They're like odd shapes. Some are large, some are small. They are meant to symbolize like 17,000 whole communities. Some of them have a name of a city on them. Most don't have any wording on them at all. Only one recognizes a single human being, and that is the stone that recognizes Janusz Korczak, who went to Treblinka with the orphans who were in his care, refusing to leave them, and shared their fate, taking, at least staying with them. He couldn't save them, but went with them himself. He is the only person who gets his own name on a stone there. Does that about answer that question, I think?
Yes, I think it does. Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
And then the first part of the question was about the model of Treblinka that's in Israel. How accurate is that?
Yes. So that model is actually by a person whose name I mentioned during the talk. It's by Yankel Virnik, who was the head of the Jewish construction detail in Treblinka. He was a master craftsman. He built much of this camp. He was forced to build it, and he was the person who was able to cross between Camp 1 and Camp 2 and be that communication. So as living human beings go, pretty much no one had better authority on what did Treblinka look like and where was it situated than Yankel Virnik. He does an absolutely amazing job, but so there's one flaw. I always hate pointing out the flaws of these, like any accidents by these folks, but you can see how Treblinka has this weird like trapezoidal shape, and Virnik's model sort of acts, I guess he kind of looked at the size of the plywood he had and he sort of fits it to the plywood. So like it becomes rational shaped when it should have this weird trapezoidal outline, but otherwise you get absolutely how it worked. It is very, very accurate. There's another model in at Treblinka itself. That one was made much later for the purposes of the Treblinka Museum. It's got the right shape and everything. Maybe it'd be interesting to also throw in, while we're talking about models, there's one more. There's a model at a Holocaust museum and community center in Melbourne, Australia, that is the product of a Treblinka survivor sort of working through his past. It's like his version of Samuel Willenberg's sculptures. It's much more a sculpture than it is a reality. It's even made out of like spare parts. It's kind of like a form of art rather than perfect representation.
We have a question in the chat asking, are there any testimonies from the women who survived Treblinka? So like written or oral? There
are a couple of short written testimonies by, their names, by the way, are Sonia Levkovich, sometimes Grabinski or Grabinska. Sonia Grabinski, Sonia Grabinska, and Sonia Levkovich are all the same person, recorded under different names at different times. That's kind of how we've long had the wrong number of women survivors as well, and it's because of that naming issue. There are a couple of short testimonies by her in Yad Vashem. Bronka Sukno is the name of the other woman who survived, and there's also very short excerpts from her dealings with court investigations into the guards and just like recording her own thoughts. Both women did not seek like a testimonial limelight. They weren't ones who went for a USC Shoah Foundation interview or anything like that. They sought the company of their fellow survivors. One of the most amazing things the family member of a survivor has ever given me is I have a DVD of a video of a survivor reunion in a cafe in Tel Aviv in the year 2000, and both of them are sitting there with 4 male survivors, sort of kind of just being their own community as they were through all of the things they went through.
Are there any connections between the Treblinka uprising and the Warsaw Ghetto uprising?
There's, it's a sort of debatable connection in how did one influence the other and vice versa. What's the thinking there? So at least 80 plus people, let me look down at my 81 people so far, my little list over here. 81 people escaped Treblinka before the revolt. Many of them with the express purpose of going back to the ghetto they had come from and warning people what Treblinka really was. I didn't really cover that in my talk, but you probably already know they would tell people that this was a transit camp, or they were just going to change, shower, get back on a train and go further east for work. So that was the Nazi ruse all the time. And in the beginning, at least, it didn't work all the way to the end. We should step away from believing that was always believed by the people arriving at Treblinka. But in the beginning, many did believe that, including Treblinka opens with the first transport of people sent out of the Warsaw Ghetto, July 22nd, 1942. So the first victims of Treblinka are from Warsaw. And those first people don't know what Treblinka is, and no human being had ever invented an extermination camp. So it's not a logical thing to believe in 1942 either. So it takes a very long time for these escapees to finally spread enough of the word, enough people come back to Warsaw to say, look, they're murdering us. We need to do something. And that I introduced to say, I think there's good reason to believe that escapees from the extermination camps telling the Jews that are still alive inside of Warsaw, look, this is what they're doing to us, has that form of resistance prior to the day of the revolt, has a lot to do with people deciding, all right, look, we have to come up with the idea of a ghetto-wide revolt because we have no other option. So I think that the information flow back and forth, it influences the revolt, and it's back and forth because trains arriving from Warsaw are getting thinner and thinner, and they are more and more destitute. Some of them are arriving at around the time of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. They arrive with wounded people on them, or the bodies of individuals that Nazis have already murdered inside of the Warsaw Ghetto. And then the arrival of those trains, or even like quick messages passed by the ones who are alive saying they're liquidating the ghetto, we're almost all gone, makes the prisoners inside of Treblinka think we better pull this off faster, because once they no longer need us, they're going to just kill all of us and close the camp. So it's back and forth. It's both ways. I don't think there's a way to say which influenced the other more or less.
So one final question. Are there any good movies about this revolt? Can you give us any recommendations, or do they exist?
If you have any film producer friends, have them call me, because they don't exist, and it's a tragedy. There is a Treblinka movie, but it's like 1985, and it stars Rutger Hauer, and it's terrible. There's a 2018 movie about Sobibor revolt, which is actually in Russian. It's a Russian film. I would have to say there isn't one on Treblinka that I would recommend, but I would say that's not a terrible movie. It's not perfectly accurate, but it's a pretty good dramatic representation. I'm seeing somebody drop a PBS link into the chat. Let me see which one they've brought up there. Treblinka's Last Witness. Yeah, that's about Samuel Willenberg. Maybe that gives me the opportunity to say he actually turned out not to be the last witness. There's a man named Leon Ritz who might still be alive and well. I haven't contacted him recently, but he lives in Sweden, and he also survived Treblinka. We only found that out if you search Leon RYTZ and Times of Israel. You will get articles by a reporter who ended up reporting, oh, wait, this is right after Samuel Willenberg's passing, and his funeral had been covered in that same paper. There's a reporter who does a story afterwards because a granddaughter reached out and goes, my grandpa's still alive and he was there. Which is kind of how this happens a lot, actually, is someone gets called the last of something and then someone else steps forward and goes, no.
Wow. Well, if there are no other questions, join me in thanking Dr. Gibbs. This was so interesting. I learned so much. This was just a fascinating discussion and conversation. And I'm going to ask you later, I'm going to email you to give some of the resources that you had talked about so I can email everybody some of the books that you had mentioned.
Sure. Yeah.
Excellent. Well,
Right.
Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.